The notary's office on Concord Street smelled like old paper and the particular kind of quiet that only exists in rooms where important things get signed. Patricia Chen had been at that desk for 31 years. I knew that because she'd told me 3 weeks ago when I'd come in alone and asked her to pull the original deed filed with Grafton County in October 2019. She'd found it in 4 minutes. She was that kind of woman. Now she was reading both documents side by side, and her face had changed. She didn't say anything at first. She set one page down, then the other, then picked up the first one again. I counted the brick tiles on the wall behind her 18, the same number I'd counted the last time I sat in this chair, the day Michael had first put the deed in front of me and said, "Sign the deed. Dad, I'll take care of you." That was 42 days ago. I had been counting since then. "Mr. Calloway," Patricia said. Her voice was careful. "This document, the one your son submitted this morning, it doesn't match what's filed with the county." She looked up at me over her reading glasses. "The property description is the same. The parcel number is the same. But the transfer conditions listed here are not what's on file. What's on file has conditions. This one doesn't." I didn't answer right away. I've learned that silence makes people say things they wouldn't otherwise say. Patricia was not that kind of person. She'd been reading real estate documents since before Michael was born, and she wasn't going to fill the silence with anything careless. She just waited, the way a person waits when they already understand that what they're looking at is not a mistake. "Do you want to call an attorney?" she asked. "I already called one," I said. "He's waiting outside." She looked at the door, then back at me. Something shifted in her expression, not surprise. Exactly. Recognition. She understood that what she'd just found was not something she'd stumbled into. It was something that had been waiting to be found. My phone buzzed on the table between us. "Michael's name on the screen." Patricia looked at it, then at me. I shook my head. Once. Quietly. She didn't ask anything more. She picked up both documents again and began making notes in the margin of her legal pad, her pen moving in the small, precise strokes of a woman who had done this before and knew exactly what it meant. Outside, Frank Russo was sitting in the hallway with a folder I'd given him 11 days ago. I'd told him to wait until I came out. "I want to tell you how we got here. I built the house in 1981. Not hired it out, built it. I was 24 years old, and I had a crew of 3 and a plot of land in Grafton County that my father-in-law sold me for $11,000 because he liked the way I shook hands. Margaret stood at the edge of the lot in October and told me where she wanted the kitchen window to face, and I moved the entire frame 6 inches east to make it work. We moved in the following March. The floors weren't finished. The back bedroom had no door. We didn't care. 38 years in the same house. I raised 2 children in it, buried a wife from it, and every morning for 38 years, I walked out the front door and could see the line of the roof I'd set myself. There were things I knew about that house that no deed could capture, the way the 3rd porch step creaked in February, the window in the back bedroom that needed a half turn of the latch to seal against the wind, the place under the kitchen sink where Margaret had written both children's heights in pencil every year until Michael turned 13 and refused to stand still for it. Margaret died in November of 2012, pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to the end. I kept working because I didn't know what else to do, and because the house needed a new water heater and someone had to pay for it. Michael was 27 when his mother died. He wore a suit to the funeral, a good one, charcoal gray, and he stood beside me at the graveside and held my arm in a way that felt real. He was living in Boston by then, working for a financial management firm. He called every 2 or 3 weeks. We talked about the Red Sox and about Sarah, his daughter, who was born the year after Margaret died. He sent photographs at Christmas. He seemed, by every measure I had, like a man who had made something of himself and hadn't forgotten where he came from. The conversations about the house started in the spring of 2019. Michael drove up from Boston on a Saturday in April, which he hadn't done in almost a year, and he brought Jennifer and Sarah, and we had lunch at the kitchen table. And Sarah drew a picture of the backyard and gave it to me. It's still in the drawer by the stove. After lunch, Jennifer took Sarah outside, and Michael opened his briefcase and set a folder on the table. He said he'd been thinking about estate planning. He said it carefully, the way he said most things measured, with pauses in the right places. He said that a man my age, working construction, with a property that had appreciated significantly, needed to think about what happened if something went wrong. He wasn't being morbid, he said. He was being practical. He said the house was worth close to $500,000 now, and that if I had a medical emergency, the estate process could tie everything up for years. He said he'd seen it happen to clients. He said he wanted to protect me. The proposal was straightforward. He said I would sign the deed over to his name, not sell transfer. I would remain in the house. Nothing about my daily life would change. But with the property in his name, he could use it as collateral if I needed emergency funds for medical care, or liquidate quickly if I needed cash in a crisis. He had a phrase for it, asset protection planning. He said it the way people in his industry said things, with the calm authority of someone who had explained it many times before. I asked him what happened if he needed the money for something else. He said he was his father's son. He said that wasn't who he was. I told him I'd think about it. I thought about it for 3 months. I asked my friend Don Garrett, who'd been a contractor for 40 years and knew more about property law than most people gave him credit for. Don said it sounded unusual, but not unheard of. He said if I trusted Michael, it was probably fine. I did trust Michael. I had no particular reason not to. In September, I had the cardiac event. Not a full heart attack. The doctors were careful about that distinction, but significant enough to require surgery. I was in the hospital for 11 days. Michael drove up and sat with me for 2 of them. He brought Sarah, and she sat in the chair by the window and colored in a book while Michael and I watched a game on the small television mounted to the wall. It felt like something. It felt like family. I came home in October and spent 6 weeks recovering. I was slower than I expected. The fatigue was something the doctors had mentioned, but that I hadn't quite believed until I was living it. Michael called more often during those weeks. He asked about my medications, about the follow-up appointments, about whether I was eating. He seemed genuinely worried. He came up in November, 3 weeks after I'd returned home. He had the folder again. He set it on the kitchen table in the same spot as before. He said the timing made sense now that after what had happened with my heart, this was exactly the kind of planning that would give him peace of mind. He said he wanted to be able to help me if something came up again. He said I shouldn't have to worry about the house on top of everything else. He said, sign the deed. Dad, I'll take care of you. I promise. I was 62 years old. I had just had surgery on my heart. My son was sitting across from me in the kitchen of the house I had built with my own hands, and he was using words like peace of mind and I promise. And he was looking at me the way his mother used to look at me when she needed me to trust her about something. I signed the deed. Patricia Chen notarized it. I didn't know her then. I didn't know that she'd been a notary for 31 years, or that she would remember my name when it came up again. I just watched her stamp the document and thought that it was done, and that my son would take care of it. Michael left that afternoon. He hugged me at the door. He said he'd call that week. He didn't call that week. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in December, I received a call from the Grafton County Register of Deeds. A woman named Ellen Greer, who had a careful, neutral voice, and who chose her words the way someone does when they're not sure how much the person on the other end already knows. She said she was calling to confirm that a property transfer had been completed and recorded. She said the property at my address had been transferred in full to Michael's name. I said, I'm sorry, in full. She said yes. She said there was no retained life estate, no co-ownership arrangement. The transfer was complete and recorded. I sat down at the kitchen table. The chair made the same sound it had always made. I looked at the window Margaret had wanted facing east, and the light coming through it was the same light it had always been. I called Michael. He didn't answer. I called again that evening, and the next morning, on the 4th call, 3 days later, the number went to a message that said the voicemail was full. I drove to the post office and sent a certified letter to his Boston address. The delivery confirmation came back signed by Jennifer. No one called. I stood in my kitchen, the kitchen of the house I had built, in the house where my children had grown up, in the house where my wife had died, and I understood, with a clarity that had nothing dramatic about it, that I had signed something I did not fully understand, at a time when I was not fully myself, because I had believed a promise. In January, about 6 weeks after the signing, Michael called on a Sunday afternoon. I was replacing a washer under the kitchen sink, the same pipes I had sweated in 1981. He asked how I was feeling. He asked about the follow-up appointment with the cardiologist. He sounded like a son. Then I said, "Michael, I've been meaning to ask what's the plan with the house. You said you'd explain the arrangement once I was back on my feet." There was a pause. Not a long one. Maybe 2 seconds. He said, "Dad, I'm in the middle of something at work. Can we talk about this another time?" I said, "Sure." He said he'd call that week. He didn't call that week. I wrote the date in the margin of the notepad I kept by the phone, January 19th. I had started keeping notes by then, the way you keep notes on a job site, not because you expect trouble, but because you've been doing this long enough to know that memory alone is not enough. In March, Carol called me on a Wednesday morning. She said she had seen a sign in the front yard, a real estate sign, the kind with a phone number and a broker's name. She described it carefully, the way Carol describes things she knows matter. She said it had gone up sometime over the weekend. I thanked her and hung up. Then I called Michael. He answered on the third ring. I told him Carol had seen a for sale sign on the property. There was a silence. Then he said, "Dad, that's not Carol must have seen something on a neighboring lot. I haven't listed anything." His voice was even, practiced. He said, "I told you, this is asset protection. Nothing is being sold." I said I understood. I said I just wanted to make sure. He said, of course, and that he'd call me that weekend, and the line went quiet. He did not call that weekend. I wrote March 11th in the margin of the notepad. Then I wrote Carol's name and the word sign in yard. Denied. I sat with that for a day. Then I went to find a lawyer. The text message came at 11:14 on a Thursday night. I know the time because I had been watching my phone for 6 days straight, the way you watch a wound that won't close. The screen lit up on the passenger seat of my truck, and for a moment I didn't move. Then I picked it up. "Dad, I sold the house. I got $485. You'll be fine. I'm moving to North Carolina with Jennifer and Sarah. I'm sorry, but this is what's best for my family." I read it 3 times. The third time, I noticed that he had not asked how I was. He had not asked where I was sleeping. He had used the word family to mean the 3 of them, Jennifer, Sarah, and himself, as if the word had always had that boundary, and I had simply never noticed where it stopped. I put the phone face down on the seat. Outside, the streetlight on Birchwood Road was doing what it always did, flickering once every 40 seconds, a thing I had meant to report to the town for 11 years, and never had. I had parked 2 houses down from my own because I could not make myself park in the driveway of a house that no longer had my name on it. I slept in the truck that night, and the next, and the one after that. On the third morning, Carol Mendez came out of her house in her bathrobe and stood on her front steps looking at my truck for a long moment before she went back inside. Carol had lived next door to me for 19 years. She had brought soup when my wife was sick. She had watched Michael and his sister grow up in that yard. 40 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up behind me, and an officer named Duval knocked on my window. I rolled it down. He was young, late 20s, maybe, and he had the careful, neutral expression of a man who had been trained to manage situations he hadn't fully understood yet. Carol was standing at the edge of her driveway with her arms crossed. She told Officer Duval, loud enough for me to hear, that I was the one who had built that house, that I had lived there for 38 years, that something was wrong and somebody needed to do something about it. Duval asked me if I was the owner of the property at 14 Birchwood Road. I told him I had signed a deed transfer to my son approximately 3 weeks prior. He looked at his notepad. He looked at Carol. He said, with genuine discomfort, that if the deed had transferred legally, there wasn't much he could do, and that I would need to find alternative accommodation. Carol said, "Robert, this isn't right." I told her I knew. I thanked her. I started the truck. That evening, I called Michael from the Walmart parking lot on Route 9, where I had moved because the lot was large and well lit and open all night. He picked up on the second ring, which surprised me enough that I didn't speak for a moment. He said, "Dad, I can't help you right now. I have a new job starting Monday, and Jennifer and I are still unpacking. You're a grown man. You'll figure it out." I asked him where he expected me to figure it out from. He said, "I don't know. A motel. A friend's place. Dad, I really can't do this right now." I said, very quietly, that he had told me he would take care of me. He said, "I got you $485,000 worth of equity. That's taking care of you." Then he said he had to go, and the line went dead. I called back. The call did not connect. I tried again. A recorded message told me the number I had dialed was not accepting calls. He had blocked me. Not in an hour. Not after sleeping on it. He had blocked me within 60 seconds of hanging up, as if he had been ready to do it, as if the number had already been queued. I sat in the Walmart parking lot for a long time after that. The lot was busy, even at that hour, families loading groceries, a group of teenagers sitting on a curb near the entrance, a man in a reflective vest collecting carts in long or slow rows. I had $240 in my wallet. I had a change of clothes in a duffel bag behind the seat. I had the truck, which was paid off, and a phone with a cracked corner from when I had dropped it on a job site in 2017 and never bothered to replace it. I made myself one promise sitting in that parking lot, and I have kept it since. I would not call Michael again. I would not send a message. I would not appear at his door in North Carolina or write him a letter or ask anyone to reach him on my behalf. I'd spent 62 years believing that if you raised a child with your hands and your time and everything you had, that child would know what a promise meant. I had been wrong about that. I was not going to keep being wrong about it by chasing after him. If Michael ever came back, it would not be because I had asked him to. I did not know yet about Frank Russo. I did not know that 3 weeks later, a woman at the county legal aid office would look at the date on my deed transfer, look at my discharge papers from Concord Hospital, and make a phone call that would change everything. I did not know any of that. I only knew what I had $240 a truck, and the particular stillness that comes when you stop waiting for someone to do the right thing and start deciding what you are going to do instead. I bought a coffee from the machine inside. It cost $1 and tasted like warm plastic. I drank the whole thing. Carol found me on the 4th morning. I had moved the truck twice since the parking lot behind the hardware store, once to the far end of the lot at the Walmart on South Main, once to the street outside the public library, where they did not ask questions and the lights stayed on until 10. Carol Mendez had lived next door to me on Birchwood Road for 19 years. She had a key to my house for emergencies, the way neighbors do when they have been neighbors long enough to stop calling it a favor and start calling it an arrangement. She had seen the for sale sign go up. She had seen it come down. She had called my cell phone 4 times in the 2 weeks after I left, and I had not answered any of them because I did not know what to say to someone who had watched me build that house and was now watching me not live in it anymore. She found the truck by accident. She had a doctor's appointment at the clinic on Loudon Road and saw my license plate in the Walmart lot as she turned in. She pulled up beside me and knocked on the passenger window at 7:15 in the morning. I was awake. I had been awake since 5. She said, "Robert, get out of the truck." I said I was fine. She said, "I know you are. Get out anyway." I got out. She looked at me the way Carol looks at things she has already made up her mind about steady, without hurry, like she was confirming something she already knew. She did not say anything about the truck, or the blanket, or the paper coffee cup on the dashboard. She said she had a spare room, and that it had been empty since her son moved to Portland, and that she would not charge me rent, and that I was not to argue with her about it. I told her I did not want to be anyone's charity case. She said, "You're not a charity case. You're a man who got robbed. There's a difference." Then she got back in her car and told me to follow her. I followed her. That was a Tuesday in late October. The leaves had already come down on Birchwood Road, and someone had raked them into piles along the curb. The house next door, my house, the one I had framed with my own hands in 1981, the one with the crack in the back foundation wall that I had patched twice and knew exactly how to patch a third time, had a lockbox on the front door and a notice from the county assessor's office taped to the window. I did not look at it long. I carried my bag inside Carol's house and put it in the spare room and sat on the edge of the bed for a while. Carol knocked and left a cup of coffee outside the door without coming in. It was real coffee. I drank it while it was still hot. That afternoon, Carol told me about Frank Russo. She had asked around. She said she had a cousin who worked at the county courthouse as a file clerk, and her cousin had mentioned a lawyer who handled property fraud cases specifically. Cases where family members had taken advantage of other family members. She wrote his name on a piece of paper and slid it across the kitchen table. Frank Russo. She had already called his office. He had agreed to a consultation at no charge. I looked at the name on the paper for a moment. Then I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket. The office of Frank Russo was not what I expected from a lawyer. It was above a dry cleaner on North Main Street in Concord, a narrow staircase, a waiting room with 4 chairs and a window that looked out over the parking lot, and a receptionist named Gail who offered me water and meant it. Frank himself came out to meet me, not the other way around. He was in his early 60s, heavier than he had probably been at 40, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a handshake that did not try to prove anything. He led me back to his office and closed the door. We sat. He had a legal pad in front of him and a pen he did not pick up yet. He said, "Tell me what happened. Take your time." I told him about the surgery, the cardiac bypass at Concord Hospital in March, the 6 hours on the table, the 2 weeks in recovery before they let me go home. I told him about Michael coming up from Boston, about the way he had handled things while I was in the hospital, about the paperwork he had brought to the house in April. I told him about the deed of transfer. I told him about the text message I had found 3 months later. I told him about the parking lot and Carol's spare room. Frank listened without interrupting. When I finished, he picked up his pen and wrote something at the top of the legal pad. Then he looked at me. He said, "When did you sign the deed?" I said it was approximately 3 weeks after the surgery. April 11th. I still had the date in my head because I had looked at the paperwork enough times by then that the numbers had stopped being numbers and started being something else, a marker, the way a scar marks the place where something happened. Frank said, "Were you still on pain medication at that time?" I said yes, oxycodone. The prescription ran through the end of April. He set the pen down. He looked at me for a moment, not the way people look at you when they are about to say something difficult, but the way people look at you when they have just found the thing they were looking for. He said, "That's your case." He explained it without hurrying. Under New Hampshire law, a deed transfer executed while the grantor is under the influence of significant medication, particularly opioid-class analgesics prescribed post-surgery, can be challenged on the grounds of diminished capacity and undue influence. 3 weeks after a cardiac bypass was not recovery. 3 weeks after a cardiac bypass was still acute post-operative care. I would have been on restricted activity. I would have been sleeping more than I was awake. My judgment, my ability to understand complex legal documents, my capacity to make permanent financial decisions, all of it would have been compromised in ways that a medical record could demonstrate clearly. He said, "Your son brought you a deed to sign while you were 3 weeks out of open-heart surgery and still taking oxycodone, and he told you it was to protect the property." I said that was correct. Frank said, "He knew exactly what he was doing, or he should have. Either way, it doesn't matter, the result is the same." He told me he would need to request my medical records from Concord Hospital. He said he would also need the original deed documents, the discharge paperwork, and any communications I had with Michael in the weeks surrounding the signing, text messages, emails, anything in writing. I had most of it. The discharge papers were in a folder in my bag. The text messages were on my phone. I had not deleted any of them, not even the ones from after Michael had gone quiet, because I had not known what to do with them, and so I had done nothing, which turned out to be the right thing. Frank made notes. He asked a few more questions about the buyer, about whether Michael had used a realtor, about whether I had received any portion of the sale proceeds. I had received nothing. The $485 had gone entirely to Michael. The house I had built in 1981 had been sold in June 2019, and I had received a text message telling me I would be fine. When Frank finished writing, he put the cap back on his pen and looked at me again. He said, "Robert, I want to be straightforward with you. We cannot get the house back. The buyers purchased it in good faith, and they are protected. What we can do is go after Michael for the full value of the sale, the $485,000 minus the standard closing costs, which puts your recovery at approximately $420,000. On top of that, given the circumstances, the medication, the post-surgical state, the deliberate misrepresentation of what you were signing, we can seek additional damages for fraud. Depending on how the judge reads it, you could be looking at $500,000 or more." I sat with that for a moment. The window behind Frank looked out over the same parking lot as the waiting room, and I could see my truck from where I was sitting. I thought about the house on Birchwood Road, about the crack in the back foundation wall, about the way the kitchen smelled in the morning when the heat came on for the first time in October. I said, "If I win, does Michael have to say he was wrong?" Frank looked at me carefully. He said, "A court judgment will establish that he committed fraud. That's a matter of public record. Whether he admits it personally is something I can't guarantee." I said, "That's what I want, more than the money. I want him to have to look at what he did." Frank said, "I understand that." He paused. Then he said, "But the money is what makes him face it. Without financial consequences, a man like this tells himself a story that he did what he had to do, that you would have been fine, that it worked out. The money takes that story away from him. The money is the truth." I thought about that. I thought about Michael in his apartment in Boston, with his financial management clients and his conference calls, and his daughter who did not know her grandfather was sleeping in a truck. I thought about the text message. "I sold the house. You'll be fine." I told Frank to prepare the file. He filed the initial paperwork on a Wednesday in early November. I know the exact date because Frank called me that evening to confirm it had been submitted to the court. I was sitting in Carol's kitchen eating the soup she had left on the stove. And when I saw Frank's number on the phone, I set down the spoon and answered. He said, "It's done." I also sent formal notice to Michael, directly certified mail, his home address in Boston. He'll have it by Friday. I thanked him and hung up. Michael called on a Sunday. 38 days since the text message. 38 days of silence. And then my phone rang at 9 in the morning with his name on the screen. I looked at it through 2 full rings before I picked up. He said, "Dad." Then, after a pause, I got a letter from a lawyer named Frank Russo. I said nothing. He said, "He's saying I committed fraud. He's saying you're going to sue me." His voice had the particular quality of a man who has prepared what he is going to say and is now saying it, working through the points in order. "That's not what happened. I was trying to help you. You agreed to this. I have your signature." Another pause. "I'm going to get my own attorney." I said, "I know you will." There was a silence on the line. Not a long one, 3, maybe 4 seconds. But I had been in enough negotiations over the years, enough moments where a foreman looks at you and you look back and neither of you speaks first, to know what that silence meant. He had expected me to argue. He had expected me to apologize, or to beg, or to say something that would give him a foothold. He had not expected 3 words delivered without heat, without urgency, without anything he could push against. He said, "Dad." I said, "Talk to your attorney, Michael." And I ended the call. I set the phone face down on the table. Carol was in the other room. I could hear the television. I picked up the spoon and finished the soup. It had gone a little cold, but it was still good. I had not planned what to say to him. I had not rehearsed it. But I had spent 38 days in parking lots and spare rooms thinking about what it means when a man stops waiting for an apology and starts building something else instead. Michael had called because he was frightened. He had called because Frank Russo's letter had made something real that he had been pretending was not real. He had called to manage me the way he managed everything, with words, with confidence, with the assumption that I would respond the way I always had. I had not responded the way I always had. I put the bowl in the sink and washed it. Outside the window, over Carol's sink, the street was quiet. Birchwood Road in November. The maple in my old front yard had lost everything by then. Just branches. Frank's discovery request arrived at David Chen's office on a Tuesday morning in late November. I know this because Frank called me that afternoon. He'd sent it by certified mail and tracked the delivery himself. He told me David Chen had signed for it personally at 9:14 Frank said. Now we wait and see what they do with it. I told him I'd been waiting for a long time already. He said he knew. I had heard Michael mention David Chen once, maybe 2 years before any of this started. We were at a birthday dinner for Sarah. She was turning 6. And Michael had rented out a back room at a restaurant in Concord. David Chen had sent a gift, a card with a handwritten note, and Michael had held it up and said, "My attorney, best in the state." He'd said it the way he said most things, with a certainty that assumed agreement. I hadn't thought about David Chen again until Frank brought up his name in October. 15 years of practice, Frank told me. Mostly civil litigation. He'd seen cases like ours before. Frank paused when he said that. Then he said, "He'll know exactly what he's looking at when he opens that file." What David Chen was looking at when he opened that file was everything Frank had assembled over the previous 6 weeks. The hospital discharge summary from March 14th, 2019, noting that I had been released 4 days after a lumbar decompression surgery with a prescription for oxycodone and instructions for restricted activity for a minimum of 6 weeks. The deed itself, signed March 19th, 5 days post-discharge. The notary's log from Patricia Chen's office, which Frank had subpoenaed, showing the appointment had been scheduled by Michael, not by me, and the text messages. Frank had requested those from my phone carrier with a preservation order, and I had given him access to everything on my end without condition. I had nothing to hide. I had never had anything to hide. The messages told a story that Michael had not intended to tell. In the weeks before the surgery, he had texted me 3 times asking about the house, its value, whether I'd had it appraised recently, whether I'd ever thought about simplifying things. I had answered each one briefly. I told him the house was worth whatever it was worth, that I hadn't had it appraised in years, and that I wasn't interested in simplifying anything. He had not pushed. He had waited. That was the part that stayed with me when Frank read those messages aloud in his office, the waiting. Michael had known how to wait when waiting served him. Then, 4 days after I came home from the hospital, the message that Frank had flagged in red in the discovery file. "Dad, I need you to sign some paperwork this week. Just a formality. To protect the house while you recover, I'll bring everything. Don't worry about it." I had answered, "Okay," 1 word. I had been on day 4 of oxycodone and could not stand up straight without holding the kitchen counter. I had answered, "Okay," because it was my son asking, and because the word protect had sounded like something a son who cared would say. And then, 11 days after the deed was signed, the message that David Chen would have read and understood immediately. "I sold the house. You'll be fine. I'll explain everything soon." He never explained anything. He never called again after that message. The word "soon" had meant nothing. Frank told me that David Chen called him on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the discovery request was delivered. Frank was in his office. He put the call on speaker and took notes by hand, which he later typed up and sent to me. I read the transcript twice at Carol's kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold before I finished. David Chen had told Frank that he needed to discuss the discovery materials. He said, and Frank had written this down verbatim, "My client has a significant exposure problem." He said the text messages created a factual record that contradicted Michael's sworn statement, in which Michael had described my signing of the deed as fully voluntary and fully informed. Frank asked David Chen to be more specific. David Chen said, "Michael stated that his father understood the purpose of the document and agreed to its terms. The messages suggest his father was not informed that the house would be sold. The message sent 11 days after the signing, 'I sold the house,' indicates my client knew, at the time of the signing, that sale was the intended outcome. He did not disclose that to his father." Frank said, "That's correct." David Chen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My client has a problem." Before that call, there had been another one. Michael had called me directly. It was a Wednesday evening, the week after Frank's discovery request went out. I was in Carol's living room. She had gone to bed early and left the lamp on for me. The phone showed Michael's name, and I looked at it for 2 full rings before I answered. He started talking before I could say anything. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't handled things well. He said he knew the house meant a lot to me and that he should have talked to me first. His voice had a quality I recognized, the same quality it had when he was 17 and had put a dent in my truck and was trying to determine how much I already knew before deciding how much to admit. He was sorry in the way that people are sorry when they have calculated that sorry is the most efficient path forward. He said, "Dad, I want to fix this. I can give you $100,000. Just tell Frank to stop." I said no. He said, "I can do $200,000. I said no. He said, "What do you want?" "Just tell me what number." I said, "I don't want a number, Michael." He was quiet. I said, "I want you to look at me and tell me that you know what you did was wrong. Not wrong because Frank Russo found the messages. Wrong because you knew it was wrong when you did it. You knew I didn't want the house sold. You knew I was on pain medication. You knew I would have said no if you'd told me the truth. I want you to say that you knew all of that, and you did it anyway." There was silence on the line. Not the silence of someone thinking, the silence of someone deciding. He said, "I can't do that." I said, "I know." He said, "Dad." I said, "Good night, Michael." I set the phone on Carol's end table and looked at the lamp for a while. The bulb was one of the old incandescent ones, warm and slightly yellow. Carol had a stack of the old bulbs in a kitchen drawer because she didn't like the new light. I had replaced one for her the previous week, standing on a step stool with my back still not fully right. Small things. I had been filling my days with small things. What Michael had said, "I can't do that," was the most honest thing he had said to me in years. He could not admit what he had done, because admitting it would have required him to become someone who understood what he had taken. Not the house, not the money, the thing that cannot be paid, back the 5 days after surgery, when I had trusted him completely, when I had signed a document in my own kitchen because my son had used the word "protect Zoo," and I had believed him. He could not look at that and name it. He could only look at the dollar amount and try to make it go away. Frank called me the morning after David Chen's call. He said, "Robert, David Chen told me his client will agree to any settlement figure we propose." He said, and, I'm quoting, "we'll lose." Frank let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "You understand what that means?" I told him I did. He said, "We can settle now. You'd get the full amount, probably the $485,000 plus damages, plus legal costs. It would be over within 60 days. I asked him what the alternative was. He said, "We go in front of Judge Finley. Everything goes on the record, Michael's statement, the messages, the medical records, all of it. It becomes public. It takes longer, but it's complete." I said, "What does complete mean?" Frank said, "It means a judge looks Michael in the eye and tells him what he did, in a room where other people can hear it." I told Frank I wanted to think about it overnight. He said that was reasonable. I did not sleep much that night. I lay in the narrow bed in Carol's spare room and listened to the house settle in the cold. Carol's spare room had a window that faced the backyard, and through it I could see the top of the old oak that stood on the property line between her lot and what had been mine. That oak was there when I built the house in 1981. I had worked around its roots when I poured the foundation. My wife had hung a bird feeder from its lower branch in 1986 and replaced it 3 times over the years. The feeder was still there, I thought. I hadn't looked closely since August. In the morning, I called Frank. I told him we were not settling. I told him I wanted to go in front of Judge Finley. Frank said, "I thought you might say that." I asked him how much longer we needed to prepare. He said 2 weeks. He said he had everything he needed. He said, "Robert, I want you to understand when we walk into that courtroom, there's no negotiating. It's all in front of the judge." I told him I understood. I told him that was exactly the point. What I did not tell Frank, because he was my attorney and not my confessor, was that I had made this decision not out of anger, but out of something quieter and more durable. Michael had been given the chance to say the true thing and had chosen not to. He had offered money because money was the only language he had left. But money, in that moment, was not what I needed. I needed what Frank had called complete. I needed a room with other people in it, and a man who had spent 23 years listening to these kinds of stories, and a set of documents that said, without ambiguity, what had happened in my kitchen on March 19th, 2019, when my son had asked me to sign something, and I had trusted him, and he had known, even then, that he was going to sell the house. I sold the house. You'll be fine. He had typed those words. He had sent them from his phone to mine. He had then not called for 6 months. Frank had those messages in a tabbed folder with exhibit numbers. David Chen had read them. And now Judge Harold Finley would read them too, in a room where the words could not be taken back. I got up, made coffee, and set Carol's kitchen table for one. Outside, the oak was bare. The bird feeder was still there, turning slightly in the wind off the street. The courthouse in Concord smelled like floor wax and old paper. I had been in that building twice before, once in 1994 when I filed a lien dispute over a commercial project on Route 3, and once in 2007 when I updated my own will after Eleanor died. Both times I had come and gone without anyone looking at me twice. On June 14th, I walked in through the same front door, showed my ID to the same security officer, a heavyset man named Gerald, who had worked that desk for at least a decade, and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Frank Russo was already waiting in the hallway outside courtroom 7. He had his briefcase open on the bench beside him and was reading through something with a highlighter. He looked up when he heard me and said, "You ready?" I told him I'd been ready for a while. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Pale wood paneling, fluorescent lights, 4 rows of gallery benches behind the bar. Michael was already seated at the respondent's table when I came in, with David Chen, his attorney, a man I had met twice and disliked both times, beside him. Michael was wearing a gray suit I didn't recognize. He had cut his hair recently. He looked, from the back, like a man who had come prepared to win something. Carol Mendez was in the 3rd row of the gallery. She had asked me 2 weeks earlier if she could attend. I told her she didn't need to ask. She was wearing a dark blue cardigan and holding her purse in her lap with both hands. When I walked past her, she didn't say anything. She touched my arm once, briefly, and I nodded. Frank and I took our seats. Michael glanced over his shoulder when I sat down. Our eyes met for less than a second. He looked away first. Judge Harold Finley entered at 9:04. He was a lean man in his mid-60s with reading glasses on a lanyard around his neck. 23 years on the family court bench. He had the walk of someone who had stopped being surprised by human behavior a long time ago. He sat, put on his glasses, and opened the folder in front of him. He read for 4 minutes without saying anything. The room was very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I counted the panels in the drop ceiling above the judge's bench. There were 11. When Judge Finley finally spoke, he did not look up from the folder. He said, "I've reviewed the full record in this matter. I want to make the court's findings clear before we proceed to any discussion of remedy." He turned a page. He said, "It is established by the evidence that on March 19th, 2019, Robert Patterson signed a warranty deed transferring the property at 14 Birchwood Lane, Millbrook, New Hampshire, to Michael Patterson. It is established that at the time of signing, Robert Patterson was 11 days post-operative from lumbar surgery and was under prescribed opioid medication. It is established that no independent legal counsel was present. It is established that the notary who witnessed the signature has testified that she was not informed of the signatory's medical condition at the time." David Chen shifted in his seat. Michael did not move. Judge Finley turned another page and said, "It is established that Michael Patterson listed the property for sale within 60 days of the deed transfer, without disclosing this intention to his father. It is established that the property sold on September 4th, 2019 for $485,000. It is established that Michael Patterson communicated the completed sale to his father via text message, a single message reading, 'I sold the house. You'll be fine.' And that no further communication occurred for a period of 6 months." He paused. He set the page down and looked over his glasses at Michael. He said, "Mr. Patterson, Do you understand what the phrase undue influence means in the context of property law? David Chen leaned toward Michael and said something quietly. Michael said, "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Finley said, "I want to make sure of that, because what this record establishes is not a misunderstanding between family members about the use of an asset. What this record establishes is that you presented documents to your father while he was medically compromised, obtained his signature under the representation that you would care for him, and then sold the property, his home of 38 years, without ever telling him that was your intention. That is undue influence. That is fraud by omission, and this court is treating it as such." The room was very still. I looked at the judge. I did not look at Michael. Frank stood. He said, "Your Honor, the plaintiff requests that the court order full restitution of the sale proceeds, including interest accrued over the 18 months since the date of sale, the statutory penalty for fraudulent transfer under RSA 545A, and reimbursement of all legal fees incurred by the plaintiff in pursuing this matter." Judge Finley said, "I've calculated those figures. The court finds that Michael Patterson owes Robert Patterson the sum of $520,000. He said the number plainly, the way you'd read a measurement off a blueprint. 520 euros. This includes the original sale proceeds of $485,000, 18 months of statutory interest, the fraud penalty, and documented legal costs." He looked at David Chen. "Counsel, your client has 30 days to satisfy this judgment in full. If payment is not received within that period, the court will issue a bench warrant." David Chen said, "Understood, Your Honor." Michael had not moved since the judge began reading. He was sitting very straight in his chair, both hands flat on the table in front of him. I watched his hands. The left one pressed down harder against the table surface, slowly, and then stopped. Judge Finley said, "Is there anything further from either party?" Frank said, "Nothing further from the plaintiff, Your Honor." David Chen said, "Nothing further." The judge removed his glasses and set them on the folder. He said, "Then this matter is concluded." He stood, and we all stood, and he walked back through the door behind the bench, and the room exhaled. I heard Carol behind me. She made a sound that wasn't quite a word, a breath, caught and released. I turned and looked at her. Her eyes were wet. She was looking at Michael's back, and her face had the expression of someone trying to reconcile two images that would not fit together. She had known Michael since he was a boy. She had brought him a birthday cake when he turned 12, chocolate, because that was what he asked for. She was looking at him now the way you look at a photograph of a place that no longer exists. Michael stood. He reached for his briefcase. He did not look at me. He moved toward the aisle between the gallery benches, walking with his eyes forward, and I said, "Michael." He stopped. I said, "Do you want to know where I slept those 38 days?" He did not turn around. His shoulders were very still. I said, "I slept in my truck, in the Walmart parking lot on Route 9. I had a sleeping bag from the garage and a cooler with food Carol brought me." I said it the same way I would describe a job site, what materials were used, what the conditions were, what the work had been. I was 62 years old, and I slept in my truck in a parking lot because my son sold my house and sent me a text message. I paused, but I knew who I was every one of those 38 days. I never had to wonder about that. You will never have that. Michael, not the money, not the house. The thing I mean is something else entirely. The room was completely silent. Not the silence of people being polite, the silence of people not breathing. Michael walked out. The door swung closed behind him. Carol pressed her hand against her mouth. The court clerk, a young woman named Abigail, who had been seated at her station through the entire proceeding, looked down at her desk and did not look up again for a long moment. Frank put his hand briefly on my shoulder and said nothing. In the hallway outside, I heard David Chen's voice, low and flat. I couldn't make out all of it through the door, but I heard enough. I heard Michael say, "I don't have $520,000. I heard David say, "Then in 30 days, you'll be arrested." There was a silence. Then Michael said he could sell the house in North Carolina. David said that would cover it, depending on equity. Then David said, You're going to have to explain to your wife why you're selling the house." Michael said something I couldn't hear. David said, "That's not my problem." Then I heard a third voice, a woman's. Jennifer had been in the hallway. I didn't know she was there until she spoke. She said, "David, what does that mean? What judgment?" Her voice had the particular quality of someone who has just understood that a conversation they were not part of has already decided something about their life. David Chen said, quietly, "Jennifer, I think you and Michael need to talk." There was a silence. Then Jennifer said, and I could hear this clearly through the door, "Michael, how much—" Michael didn't answer right away. Carol, beside me, had gone very still. She was looking at the closed door, the way you look at something you cannot take back. I stayed in the courtroom while the gallery cleared. Carol waited with me. When it was just the two of us and Abigail at her clerk's station, Carol said, "He used to ask me for extra frosting." She meant the birthday cake. She said it quietly, not to me particularly, just to the air in the room. Then she picked up her purse and stood. She said, "Come on, I'll make lunch." I signed the acknowledgement of judgment at the clerk's window. Abigail handed me my copy and said, "Good luck, sir." I thanked her. I folded the document along its crease and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, next to the worn spot where I used to keep my measuring tape when I was working. I had carried that tape for 21 years before I retired. The pocket still had the shape of it. Carol and I took the elevator down together. In the lobby, Gerald, the security officer, looked up from his desk as we passed. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. We walked out into the June morning, and the air smelled like cut grass from the park across the street. And the sky was the particular pale blue that comes in New Hampshire in early summer, before the heat has settled in for good. I had a copy of the judgment in my pocket. The oak in Carol's front yard would have its leaves by now. The bird feeder would still be turning in the wind. That was enough. That was, for the moment, exactly enough. The judgment was entered on a Thursday. By the following Tuesday, Frank had filed the enforcement order. Michael's attorney, a man named David Crane, who had spent most of the hearing looking at his shoes, withdrew from the case 9 days later. I know this because Frank called to tell me, and because the court sent a notice to my new address on Birch Street, the apartment I'd been renting since October. Michael sold the North Carolina house in August. The listing price was $349,000. It sold for $310,000. After closing costs and the real estate commission, the net was $260. Frank's office received the wire transfer on a Wednesday afternoon. He called me at 4:17 p.m. I was eating a sandwich at the kitchen table. I wrote the amount down on the back of an envelope and put the envelope in the drawer under the phone. I did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. The money existed. That was the fact. The court had looked at what Michael did and said this was wrong, and here is the number that proves it. I did not need the money to live on. I had my pension, and I had the disability payments from the knee surgery, and I had the apartment on Birch Street that cost $740 a month and had a window that faced east, so the morning light came in before 7. The $260,000 went into a savings account at the same credit union I had used since 1979. I did not touch it. I did not look at the balance more than twice in the first year. It sat there the way a verdict sits, not useful in any daily sense, but present. Proof. Michael was arrested in September, 6 weeks after the wire transfer. He did not have the remaining $195,000. He was released after 2 days on the condition that he make monthly payments of $1,200 toward the balance. At that rate, the debt would take more than 13 years to clear. His employer, a financial management firm in Charlotte, terminated his contract within 2 weeks. They managed other people's money. Michael had been there for 6 years. He cleaned out his desk on a Friday. Jennifer filed for divorce in November. Sarah was 8 years old. Carol had a sister in Charlotte, and the sister had a neighbor who knew Jennifer from the school pickup line. The world is not as large as it appears. Carol called me on a Saturday morning in December, about 3 months after the arrest. She said she had seen Michael at the grocery store on Route 9. He had been back in Concord for a few weeks by then, staying with a college friend. She said he looked tired. I told her I knew. She asked if I wanted to see him. I told her no. I told her he knew where to find me if he wanted to talk. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he had Sarah with him at the store. She was carrying the basket. I did not say anything to that. She said one more thing before we hung up. She said that her sister in Charlotte had told her Jennifer had asked about me not recently, but in the weeks after the divorce was filed, Jennifer had asked the neighbor whether I was all right, whether I had somewhere to live. Carol said her sister had the impression that Jennifer hadn't known about the parking lot, that she hadn't known about the 38 days. Carol said, I don't think she knew what he told her about the house. I said I didn't know either. I said it didn't change anything. And it didn't, but I thought about it after we hung up. There is a difference between someone who helps take something from you and someone who simply didn't ask enough questions. I have not decided entirely which one Jennifer was. After we hung up, I stood at the kitchen window for a while. The bird feeder Carol had given me for the apartment railing was turning slowly in the wind. I had filled it that morning with the same seed I used to buy for the feeder at Millbrook Road. 2 years passed. In February, I received a letter. The handwriting on the envelope was Michael's. I recognized the way he formed the capital M, the same way he had written it since he was 12 years old, and his teacher had praised him for his penmanship. Inside was a single page. He wrote that he was sorry. He wrote that he had had a great deal of time to think. He wrote that he understood what he had done and that he wanted to see me. He did not explain what he thought the meeting would accomplish. He did not ask me to forgive him. He just wrote that he wanted to see me and that he thought I should know he had been thinking about the 38 days. He wrote those words exactly the 38 days. I read the letter 3 times. Then I put it on the kitchen table and left it there. I made coffee. I went to work. I had taken a part-time position with a contractor in Concord, supervising foundation inspections. Nothing that required me to climb or kneel, just to walk a site and read what the ground was telling me. I had been doing that for a year, and it suited me. I came home that evening, and the letter was still on the table. I left it there for 3 weeks. On a Sunday in March, I wrote back. I told him I would meet with him. I told him there was one condition. I told him that before he came to see me, he needed to sit down with Sarah and tell her what he had done, not a version of it, not a softened account designed to protect his position as her father, the actual thing that he had asked his father to sign over the house, that he had sold it, and that he had not called again. I wrote she deserves to hear the truth from you, not a version of it that arrives later from someone else. I sealed the envelope and mailed it the same afternoon. He has not come to see me yet. That was 14 months ago. I do not know if he has spoken to Sarah. I do not know if he intends to. I check the mailbox on Birch Street each morning the way I check the weather without expectation, as a matter of habit. The $260,000 is still in the credit union account. Last spring, I sat down with Frank, and we updated my will. I left the account to Sarah, not to Michael. The instruction I gave Frank was specific, and Frank wrote it into the document exactly as I said it. If Michael wishes to contest in this bequest, he must first provide a written statement, signed and notarized, acknowledging to his daughter that he defrauded her grandfather. If he cannot make that statement to his own child, he has no standing to claim the money. Frank looked up from his notepad when I finished. He said, "That's clean." I told him I knew. I've lived on Birch Street for 3 years now. The apartment is smaller than Millbrook Road, by a measure. I stopped calculating a long time ago. The east window still catches the morning light before 7. The bird feeder still turns. I retired from the inspection work last fall when the knee told me it was time, and now I spend the mornings reading and the afternoons walking the park across from the old courthouse on South Street, where the elms have grown back enough to give shade again. I never went back to the house on Millbrook Road. I drove past it once, in the fall of 2022, without planning to. The new owners had painted the trim a color I did not recognize. There was a child's bicycle on the porch. I drove on. I never said a word against Michael to anyone who did not already know the case. Not to Carol. Not to the men I worked with. Not to anyone. What happened is in the public record of Merrimack County. Anyone who wants to know can read it there. I filled the feeder this morning before 7, while the light was still coming in low through the east window. The oak on the property line between Carol's lot and what used to be mine is older than my son. It was there when I poured the foundation in 1981. It will be there when the judgment is paid off. 13 years from now, assuming Michael keeps making the payments. It doesn't ask to be thanked for any of that. It just stands. I put the seed bag back in the cabinet under the sink and washed my hands and made coffee. The letter from Michael is still in the drawer. I haven't decided yet.